Okay. Oopsie. I will call this meeting of the Lexington Planning Commission to order on August 22nd, 2024 at 5 p.m. And the first item on our agenda is approval of the agenda. Do I have a motion, or are there any comments, concerns, changes?
I move approval of the agenda.
I second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? And the motion carries. And next on the agenda is the approval of minutes from the August 8th, 2024 meeting. Any comments? It was very thorough. Thank you very much, Kate. Any?
My favorite thing to do with the minutes is to motion to approve.
Second.
All in favor? And opposed? And the motion carries. Okay. The next item on the agenda are citizens' comments on matters that are not on the agenda. So I open the floor to public comment and close that public comment session and move on to new business. So the first item of new business is CUP 2024-02, an application by John Adamson to renew a conditional use permit allowing a portion of the building located at 2 South Main Street, tax map number 23-1-194, and owned by Rockbridge Partners, LLC, to continue to be used as a public assembly and an educational facility, college/university, and to acknowledge the educational facility, college/university use for the remainder of the building. Arnie, can we have a staff report? Yes, sorry, before the staff report.
Yes, so I am going to declare a conflict and recuse from discussion of the two conditional use permits. And so I'd like to read my disclosure and leave the dice.
Great.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Thank you. In accordance with Virginia Code 2.23112A and 3115, I declare that I have a personal interest in the City of Lexington Planning Commission's consideration of conditional use permits 2024-02 and 2024-05 that may disqualify me from participating. Choosing to err on the side of caution in this respect, hereby recusing myself from discussion and voting. My personal interest relates to my employment with Washington and Lee University, 204 West Washington Street, Lexington, Virginia, 24450, which has a leasehold interest in the properties that are subjects of the conditional use permit applications in question, identified as TM number 231194 and TM 23172A, respectively.
Thank you.
I have a disclosure as well, but I'm not going to recuse myself. I have a conflict disclosure in accordance with Virginia Code 2.2-3112A and B and 2.2-3115H. I declare that I have a personal interest in the City of Lexington Planning Commission's consideration of conditional use permit 2024-02 and 2024-05 because of my husband's employment with Washington and Lee University, 204 West Washington Street, Lexington, Virginia, 24450. Washington and Lee University has a leasehold interest in the property that is subject of the conditional use permit application, both applications, which are identified as TM 23-1-194 and TM 23-1-72A. I am not disqualified from participating in this transaction because I'm a member of a group of 3 or more who are affected by the transaction, and I can participate in the transaction fairly, objectively, and in the public interest.
Great. Thank you both. Okay. Anybody else? Okay. Arnie?
Okay, with no further declarations, good evening to you all. When we realized that this needed to be renewed because it was on a 15-year period for approval that had expired or was about to expire, I thought this would be a fairly simple renewal of a conditional use permit, not unlike others that we have done before, but I could not have perhaps been more wrong. What we're having a request to do is to allow an updated version of the conditions that we had previously with it one addition to that. And we'll get into those quickly. But again, we're asked to look at a conditional use permit that was approved in 2009 for an educational facility, for a private school and assembly hall. And we have changed our terminology since the update. So in 2009, we had a different zoning code. 2016, 2017, we went through that massive update and our terms changed a bit. So if you could look over on page 2 of 5 or on page 8 of your overall packet, what was approved was a conditional use permit with the following 2 conditions. Number 1, that only the courtroom or the vault room be utilized for private school or assembly purposes. The determination of which space would be used for this purpose is to be determined by the applicants. Applicants there being the Rockbridge County and Rockbridge partners. So those are the applicants that were involved at that time. And then the second one is that the conditional use permit be issued for a period of 15 years. I made the assumption because we had seen so many large capacity houses that had been on a 5-year renewal or 2-year renewal, depending on what sort of cycle they were on at that particular time, that perhaps that was just a typical renewal period. But a little birdie told me that maybe we should look at the deed, and the deed did reveal that there was a commitment made by the developer for a 15-year period for that public access and public assembly portion, and that is now expired. So the applicant could certainly come before you if they no longer desire to have the public assembly or even the private school use in the building and could just continue with the offices that are there today. One other thing, and you received an email earlier today that we passed along to you from a former council member. And just to sort of clarify one of the particular items that was stated in his email is that the uses, the office use in the courthouse, my presumption, my determination from the condition that you see before you, that the office use was not considered part of the private school. And the reason for that is the way the condition is written. And we also have minutes or a memorandum to city council that I found in the previous CUP application. There wasn't much in that file, but for the 2009 approval, we did find a memorandum from the Planning Commission to City Council dated March 27th, 2009, asking for a private school and an assembly hall. And that the first item here, this property is zoned commercial district, central business, which is the C1. Private schools and assembly halls are authorized in this district only with a conditional use permit. And then number 2, the Planning Commission recommended that this application be approved with the following 2 conditions. And the first one being with the one I've already read, which is that only the courtroom or vault room be utilized for private school or assembly purposes. If office was truly part of private school, then it would have been a CUP for the entire building and not just for the 2 rooms specific for private school and assembly. So I can only read and interpret what I have from minutes or a memorandum and also what we have in the packet. So I do not think that at that time office use was considered to be part of the school. It was, I presume, considered to be a by right use, because if we look at the zoning ordinance that was in effect at that time, the office use was a by right use downtown, as it is now. It's only when it's now, because of the change in the definition or because of a new definition, that the administrative facilities portion, which is the office use, now requires a CUP. So that is one of the changes that has occurred in that 2016, 2017 update. I did provide you on the bottom of page 8 the definition previously for private school, trying to figure out what was allowed and what wasn't allowed, looked at the previous code, and we did not have a definition for private school or for school, private. But we did in 2017 add in a definition for educational facility. We have one for primary, secondary, and now we also have one for college and university. And I'll read that in the record. Educational facility, college, university is an education institution authorized in the Commonwealth of Virginia to award associate, baccalaureate, or higher degrees in facilities associated with it. This term includes academic buildings, administrative facilities, dormitories, special housing, parking areas, dining halls, and other physical plants associated with the college or university use. And I've underlined administrative facilities. Cannot remember exactly the uses that are the W&L related uses that are going into the building. Perhaps the applicant, when he gets a chance to come before you and make comments, will discuss what particular uses are going in. But my understanding is that they are office uses and that they were therefore, in my opinion, again, fall under this administrative facility portion. And anything that is a educational facility is a conditional use permit in the C1 district. So you could argue that we have gone from private school that's undefined to educational facility, university college that has a more encompassing definition. And that's why in the next application, we're having to do that. But it's also part of the request this evening for the old courthouse, because again, or maybe to state a little bit more clearly, the current offices that are there being utilized by W&L were not part of the CUP in 2009. So they are a legal non-conforming use. They can continue. Now, with all legal nonconformities, you have some limitations that can't be expanded. So it's just beneficial to the applicant to ask for that particular conditional use permit to be codified or added to the CUP request, so that it's just 100% clear that it is now not a permitted use, but it is a use that is allowed through a conditional use permit, and that he won't be therefore limited by any of the limitations that we have for legal non-conforming uses. Any questions in particular to the conditions that have been mentioned, sort of what changes we have had since 2009 and what the request is?
I do. I have a question. Would this particular request this evening be just in regards to those two spaces in the old courthouse then? Is that right? Am I understanding
And
it?
condition number one, if we go forward with that, and that is the request by the applicant to have condition one remain in place. So that would be that only the courtroom or the vault room be utilized, and we're changing private school now to educational facility because that's the updated definition, and then changing or for public assembly because that's the updated for assembly use, and that the determination of which spaces will be used for this purpose is to be determined by the applicants. So that really doesn't change. So it is asking for those two uses in either one of those two spaces. But the thing that does change is number two, just sort of codifying and allowing the administrative office portion of it to go into the rest of the building. It's already there, but just sort of making it an actual conditional use. Does that answer the question?
Thank you. Yep.
If there are no other questions, I'll start into your conditions of issuance for a conditional use permit, which is on page 10. As you know, you have discretion in a conditional use permit. You can put conditions on additional conditions, the two that have been requested and also are being recommended by staff, but you do have the ability to recommend additional conditions. Now, there are certain sort of parameters for that. They should be in line with what you expect the impact to be, as an example. But just to quickly go through what your conditions of issuance are in letter A, the proposal will not affect adversely the health, safety of persons residing or working in the neighborhood of the proposed use. And I gave you from my 2 cents in my opinion following that. In item B, the proposed use will not be detrimental to the public welfare or unduly injurious to property values or improvements in the neighborhood. C, the proposed use will not be in conflict with the policies and principles of the city's adopted comprehensive plan. And the one direct strategy in the comp plan is that land use 2.3, and I gave you all copies of that on a separate sheet of paper for your consideration. And then D, adequate public services, including streets and other traffic ways, utilities, police and fire protection are or reasonably will be available to support the proposed use. And then the last item that's a little bit buried in number 3, and you can also consider other reasonable land use and zoning considerations as may be required by the nature of the proposed use or as may be otherwise appropriate to effectuate the intent of this chapter, and the governing body shall designate such conditions as it deems necessary to carry out the intent of this chapter. Sorry, I don't always go through each of those individually, but I think we're going to have a little bit more back and forth potentially this evening with some input from the public or additional input from the public. So I just wanted to focus in sort of on your criteria for your review and your decision this evening. And then we,
I have a question to follow up on the previous one. Back on page 9, to renew the conditional use permit. Why are we including number 3? That the conditional use permit provide the remainder of the building may be utilized for administrative facilities.
that's a request from the applicant. So we asked the applicant, what does he want to do with the conditions that he has in place? Certainly doesn't have a commitment anymore in the deed to go forward with some of these. So his response was that his preference and request is that condition number 1 remain in place, that condition number 2 be amended to grant the renewal in perpetuity. So that's why we struck out that 15-year period. And number 3 is really the revised number 2 in the strike through and underline version. So number 3 is a request that the remainder of the building be utilized for administrative facilities. So we changed number 2, got rid of the 15-year period and just used that number to be that the remainder of the building may be utilized for administrative facilities related to the educational facility, college, university use. So that number 3 is just ended up being number 2, if that makes any sense at all. And I have to reiterate perhaps that the office use that's in the building is considered a legal nonconformity, and he can continue with that use without having this condition necessarily approved. It could be withdrawn as an example, but that is a legal nonconformity currently. And he's just adding that to be codified, might not be the right word, but put in the record and expressly approved as a conditional use permit for administrative facilities.
Right.
May I
And
ask one-
yeah,
one-
go ahead.
Just one question. I've always had a trouble with double negatives. So can you explain the legal nonconformity versus that they're just using it as office space, which is allowed under C2, C1 by right? So I'm trying to understand that.
I'll go back a little bit in that my interpretation, because of the way the conditions are written,
Mhm.
is that the office use was considered to be regular office and not part of private school.
Right, right.
So since it's office use, regular office use, that was allowed by right in 2009. And it wasn't until 2016, 2017, actually, that we made the definition for an educational facility where now administrative facilities for the university are a conditional use. Therefore, what they have approved in 2009 for office use was approved legally at that point, and therefore is a legal nonconformity. It's no longer conforming because today, if you put the administrative facilities for university use into a building downtown in the C1 zoning district, as exemplified by our next CUP application, that requires a conditional use permit. But since they had it before the change, therefore they are, a lot of people like to use the word grandfather. Grandfather actually means something a little bit different, but they have a use that conformed to the code when they went in, and it's just non-conforming now because we changed the code. They have the right to continue it. They just don't have the right to expand it.
Okay. Thank you, Arnie. That's a good explanation.
And speaking of expanding it, would you say that so a legal non-conforming use, you're not allowed to make it more non-conforming, right? Would you say that allowing it to go into perpetuity is expanding the non-conformity?
No, I would think it's more physical in the sense that if it went into other portions of the building, or the building had another floor added to it or a wing, and it then expanded into that without a conditional use permit expressly, then I think that's more of than necessarily time and being in perpetuity.
Okay. And then, so what you're saying is that Washington and Lee is not allowed to lease office space in C1 districts without a CUP.
Correct, because of the change that we had in
Right.
2017, intentional or not, but we added a definition that clearly includes administrative facilities for the university in the C1 zoning district requires a conditional use permit.
Okay. Okay. All right. Do you have anything else in your report?
I think that's all I have. Happy
Okay.
to answer any questions.
Any other questions for Arnie?
One, yes, thank you.
Mhm.
What about the Press Brown building? How do we,
We
just
can-
trying to understand that it's in a way a similar situation and it didn't come before us in a conditional use permit.
That is going to be a little bit different in that we simply didn't catch it, if you will. Didn't realize that with that change that he would have, that a conditional use permit would have been required. There's something called vested rights. So after we make a determination in the applicant, and I'm going to very much summarize or paraphrase this, if they make significant investment based on information that we have given them, and I think you can certainly argue that for the Press Brown building because the amount of investment that occurred in that building, and we didn't tell them that they needed a conditional use permit, and we gave them building permits and other approvals, including COA approvals. So they are what I would consider a vested right, and they will not have to come back for a conditional use permit unless something changes over there, such as a different tenant. Well, a different tenant wouldn't require that, but unless something changes of significance, they have a vested right there.
Just for the record, which building is that, Arnie?
115 West Nelson, Press Brown, what's
Across from the Hopkins.
correct?
Yes. Okay, any other questions?
One more,
Yeah, go
just
for
for
it.
clarification.
Mhm.
So a lot of the effort over the years, and I've talked to people who were involved in the early 2009 decision, was over the conditional use permit for those two spaces, as we clarified. The interesting thing is over the years, it hasn't been used as much as foreseen. And the question arises whether or not that as an assembly area or something that's available for public use is really a secondary use. It's not a primary use of that space. So I'm just wondering how much effort we put into building a CUP around the use of two spaces for the purposes of public assembly when it's not their primary purpose versus a theater, for example. So I'm just,
Is there a question or is that more of a
well,
statement?
it's more of a reflection. Yeah. You don't have to answer it on. Just thank you.
So you're saying that having since it's just the vault room and the courtroom that are in item 1 in the conditional use.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I'm not following what you're
Well,
getting at.
the conditional use permit, item 1 was put in place so they could be used. Those two rooms could be accessible and used
Mhm.
by the public. In effect, they're not used as it was intended,
You mean as public gathering spaces?
public gathering.
But it
you-
does say private school or public assembly.
Okay. My point is that as an assembly area, it's a secondary use to the building. It's not the
Yes.
primary use.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
Okay. If there are no further questions or comments, does our applicant have a statement? And if so, if you'll come up to the dais or the podium and state your name and address for the record.
I'm John Adamson, 9301 River Road, Richmond, Virginia. Good afternoon. How are you? When Arnie and I started this journey together on renewing the cup, I didn't realize it was going to attract attention. It was sort of bringing things forward that were sort of just updating and bringing things into compliance. For the record, just addressing 115 West Nelson briefly, we talk regularly. I'm in the building office regularly, and there was no intention of doing anything other than refurbishing a building on Nelson Street that was in terrible need of refurbishment, that had been laying in a pattern of disrepair for 15 years or longer. And so I just want to make sure that's abundantly clear that I in no way tried to get anything past anybody, full stop. With regard to the courthouse, there were two spaces, and at the time we did this in 2008, when most of those negotiations were, there weren't many meeting spaces downtown. There was this room, there was the Piavana room, and so we were looking for quality meeting spaces in order to have different gatherings. Since then, we've got the back of the Gin Hotel, we've got the Patton Room, we've got the back of the Livery. There are lots and lots, thankfully, of really awesome meeting spaces. So maybe this is less important. Being someone who's met several people in that room, it's a fabulous meeting room, and accommodates people well from an acoustic standpoint, from a presentation standpoint. It works in lots of different configurations. I really felt like, even though I don't have a deed requirement to do it anymore, I felt like I just had a commitment to Lexington, and I feel like the tenant felt a commitment to Lexington to maintain a room that was available for the public to say, hey, we'd like to have a meeting and come enjoy the space. So that was the spirit that this has come forward. And it was open armed. And I'm happy to answer any questions if anybody has any, but I don't know how to be more sincere or direct than that.
Thank you. Does anybody have any questions?
How would somebody go about using that space? Like, how do you request it? What does that process look like?
So I'm assuming that Lori Oliver, who works in that building, is the one, and maybe this has since changed, so forgive me for not knowing the exact parameters, but if this request came to me, I would run it to ground. But Lori Oliver, I believe, handles the scheduling for that room, and you would just petition her. Now, I'm sure there's a little weirdness around COVID, as there was for many meeting spaces, but outside of that, that would be the process. And then you just reserve the room to make sure there wasn't a conflict, and there you go.
And that continues at this point?
To the best of my knowledge, yes, ma'am. And if there was an issue with that, I would certainly be happy to take it up with any parties that I needed to.
And I was just reading the deed recently, and probably we should have forwarded. I didn't realize this was going to come up as a discussion, but may it look like the deed was a requirement by the county when you purchased it. And it was more for reading the deed. It was more for use for county and city of Lexington meeting spaces, though it did say, other parties could meet there if they have the insurance requirements. So it's been nice that we've had it for some public meetings, and there have been public meetings that have occurred. But is my recollection right that really was originally intended more for the two localities to use, but it's been expanded to allow everybody?
That's my understanding. And then that sort of morphed into more of a public meeting space because there weren't other spaces to sort of have those gatherings. Again, that's changed over the years.
Mm-hmm.
Given what you've mentioned about the growth of the availability of other spaces now, and picking up on what Leslie has just said, that the two public entities have not really used that space. I guess the basic question I have is, does the use of that space need to be tied to a CUP? Or is it just an agreement, that yes, we will make that space available? Or so I'm not sure why we're tying a lot into the use of that space into the conditional use permit. Again, sorry, not really a question to you, but just a reflection that maybe the original intention is shifted and we no longer need that to be clarified as part of a CUP.
So and Arnie may clarify this, but my understanding at the time for the public school or for whatever the language was specifically that has been modified in recent times, that it did require a conditional use and it did have a sunset after 15 years. So coming forward and bringing this application forward, it was intended to just renew and be in compliance. And then secondarily, which was added to, we do have whatever the specific wording was, a non-conforming by right use, I guess. And
Legal non-conformity.
legal non, thank you very much.
I have a hard time with that too.
The request was, again, open-armed. Let's just bring it forward and bring it all in compliance. It doesn't matter to me whether, I want to get away from being non-conforming and be conforming. That's what I aspire to do. So that's the reason.
Okay.
But a lot of this is kind of driven by the ordinances and the zoning and the codes. And so I'm trying to play within the box and with Arnie's guidance.
If I could just add one thing to that, the question is, even though the public assembly may not be as major a use anymore, it's more of an accessory use. But if there's going to be any public assembly in the building, or if there's going to be any educational facility, college, university use, it's a conditional use permit. So even if it's only utilized once a month or less, it is a use that is a conditional use, and therefore it has to be included in the conditional use permit. And the applicant is asking for that specifically, that those two uses be renewed and be put into perpetuity. So any public assembly use in the building, other than the administrative use that we've already talked about, and other than the classroom use that was, I believe, intended or possibly intended in 2009, those things require a conditional use permit.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I
Thank you both.
do have a question for you. I'm out of curiosity, would you be willing to consider having, like if we were to separate these out and say 1 and 2 are one entity, and then conditional use 3 is a separate one, would you still go forward with 1 and 2? Would you want to have a conditional use permit in perpetuity for the public use and of public use and educational use of the vault room and the courtroom without the rest of the building?
I'm not totally sure I understand the reasoning for the question. But without any action today,
Mhm.
The public, just as I understand it, loses access to those spaces for meetings.
Mhm.
With action today, that's still an option, whether we're having meetings about courtyard improvements or whatever other community meetings
Sure.
are in this space. With regard to the other use, I would,
Sorry, which other use are you?
the number 3, I think you're
Yeah.
referring to, for the rest of the building. I would hope that in the spirit of what we would want to do is that we would want to bring it to a conforming use if it's by right a legal non-conforming. Because it's still sort of one and the same, unless I'm not totally following why you wouldn't want to.
Let me try and make it clearer. So I'm wondering, and maybe Arnie, this is something that you could speak to. I'm thinking that a conditional use permit for the two larger spaces, vault and courtroom, if it was a perpetual CUP for public use, that could you separate it out that way and then have a 15-year leash on a CUP for educational facilities for the entire building, whether it be offices or those 2 buildings for classes? I mean, rooms for classes.
From my lens, and maybe I'm thinking about this the wrong way, but if I have a legal non-conforming use in perpetuity for the time being.
Mhm.
To restrict that back when I'm trying to come forward and do something good for the community doesn't feel as good if I'm speaking just plainly. So, um, I'm not positive that that would make a lot of sense. I would rather either just leave it legal non-conforming. And then with regard to the other meeting spaces, if the board didn't see fit and renewing the CUP on that, then I would be disappointed for the community, but I would respect and understand the decision. If you wanted to put a time frame on that, so we came back in a period of time to discuss it again, then that would certainly be the up to the board.
And Mr. Adamson, do you have a long-term lease with W&L on that property?
I do. I don't know exactly what the timing of the lease would be, but it would be fair to say that it would be in excess of 10 years.
Yeah.
But there is absolutely a lease. And at the end of the lease, they absolutely have the right to hand me the keys and say, we're done. So
And at the time the building was sold to you, it was understood that W&L was going to rent that space. Was that known yet or not yet?
so it was actually very much known, and it was very public because while my great-grandfather went to school in Lexington, and my grandfather and my father and every single one of my siblings, we were young developers. And, the courthouse was a prized building on a very important corner in town. And the enigma through a very public process, an RFP, was, what do we do with the old courthouse? And so we put together a concept that said, who are the users locally that can use a building that's 16,500 feet that was built in 1896? And there was only one real logical user, and it required a lot of investment to take it from a 1950s era renovated building to a more modern space with life safety and a limited area sprinkler and monitored fire alarm system and all new electrical, HVAC, plumbing, etc., updated elevator, etc. So yes, it was very much known that Washington and Lee was the tenant, and they were helping sort of protect and stabilize that corner. It was a really important corner for downtown. And at the same time, Matt Giannini and Schweitzer were doing the First National Bank building, and I'm probably giving everybody a history lesson they already know. And then as a result of the courthouse project, another Richmond family, all known to people in this room, approached and said, we would like to sort of update a former inn business, and that morphed into the Georges, and I was neck deep in all of that. But each of these sort of allowed the next step from an economic development to happen. And, Main Street's a little different today than it was in 2008. There are no empty shop storefronts. It is a little more vibrant. It feels more special, if that's possible. So.
Thank you. Any other questions?
I have a really quick question. Again, this is sort of just for the public record, because there may be people who don't right now have a sense of what kind of administrative facilities or administrative functions are taking place in the old courthouse. What's taking place there now?
The main function is the business office.
The business
So
office.
the treasurer.
Okay.
And HR.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Well, we will now open the floor for public comment. If anybody in the public would like to come up and make a statement, please come up to the podium and state your name and address for the record, please.
Good evening, everyone. Rebecca Logan. What is my address? 1315 River Road, Buena Vista, Virginia. Thank you for allowing me to speak. I have been working closely with Mr. Adamson on some of these properties, and I found him to be quite sensitive to the needs of our downtown and our businesses. I've spoken to a couple of businesses to ask how they feel about the 2 stories above in the Rockbridge building being used as offices for W&L, and everybody is mostly happy to see additional feet on the street. They have to eat somewhere, hopefully do a little shopping. And as far as I understand, that the department that is going in there already has a presence downtown. They are in separate buildings off of Randolph Street.
I'm just going to interrupt you real quick. Are you talking about the old courthouse building or are you talking about the
I'm
Rock?
sorry, I'm talking about the Rockbridge building.
Okay, so
Probably hold off on that.
yeah,
because that's
Okay.
let's
next.
restrict
Public
your
hearing.
comments to the courthouse building,
I'm
please.
sorry,
No
jumping
problem.
ahead.
Mm.
You might want to know that the community room is used quite a bit.
Okay.
We do a lot of our meetings there when we have large gatherings. We have had lunch meetings there and brought lunch in, and it has to be arranged through Miss Oliver, and she's always very accommodating. And then back in 2018, I believe, we did our entire Launch Lex program in that building in the evenings for 12 weeks. So that room is used.
That's great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? Please state your name and address.
I'm Jeff Hughes, 342 Jacobs Ladder. We have a business downtown, my family-owned sugar maple trading company. We went through Launch Lex in that room, so we used it as part of our launch of our business. So that was a very important part of our family's history. I've used that room for lots of different things. It seems like I'm in there of all the rooms available to us. We use that one the most. I even taught how to build a terrarium class in there. So I would hate to see that be lost as a community asset. It is unique in that it has all the technical things that you need to make a presentation. It's state of the art. And so it makes a presenter look a lot better than they probably are. But anyway, I would support continuing to make this a public asset.
Thank you. All right. Anybody else from the public want to make a comment? If not, then I am going to read into the record an email that was forwarded to the Planning Commission from Patrick Ramey. He said he sent it on Wednesday, August 21st of 2024. Dear members of the Planning Commission, my apologies. I have other commitments tomorrow evening and I'm unable to attend your meeting. I would like to provide written public comment on CUP 2024-02 and 2024-05. I can't separate these out because they're all throughout. So regarding CUP 2024-02, the recommendation by the planning administrator is perplexing. I served on planning when we redid the zoning code under Arnie's excellent guidance. One thing that Arnie, Darren, and others strongly advocated was moving away from the tangle of CUPs that plagued the city at the time, instead ensuring uses were either allowed by right or not at all. The many CUP exceptions that existed at that point, often going back decades and having rich verbal histories but little in writing, were a mess that we sought to eliminate. Oddly, however, Arnie seems to have reversed course. I don't know what it is about this CUP that's different, either in its content or the nature of the applicant or the institution that would engage in the use, but I can say the following with confidence. From a planning perspective, this is bad practice. We specifically did not include the use by right in C1 in hopes of limiting the creep of our cherished billionaire institutions such that we're able in their methodical takeover of the town. Making an exception because Adamson, W&L, or the other very important entity asks is deeply inappropriate and a betrayal of the public trust. 2, overwhelming opposition by Lexington citizens to W&L's continued creep is well documented, most recently in their attempt to destroy the Triangle neighborhood on McLaughlin. I'm sure we haven't heard the end of all that, unfortunately. The matter before you is of a similar nature, in that it removes square footage from the community that would likely otherwise be of commercial or residential use and de facto makes it a W&L space. 3, offices and meeting spaces may seem an innocuous use, but aside from being less square footage for productive commercial endeavors, for which the city receives revenue, it's also creeping into typically residential spaces above downtown businesses. Residential space is not only essential to dealing with our local housing shortage, but also to the vibrancy of downtown. When people work but don't live in downtown areas, be they big or small, it destroys communities. On CUP 2024-05, I think Arnie's analysis is incorrect. My understanding is that the use up for renewal is the same as the use requested for CUP 2024-02, educational facility, which is not a by right use. This includes the WNL offices in the courthouse. Further, it is a condition specifically requested by the applicant on page 17 of your packet, recognizing that the applicant does not believe it to be a by right use under the 2009 permit and zoning code. Arnie is engaged in a little revisionist history, I think. The private school designation was the CUP. To include the administrative offices, it is a school that is private, as well as meeting spaces. The absence of a more elaborate definition of the 2009 code does not make it a by right use because it's an office by administrators of a private school. The use of the building entire is the subject of the CUP as intended in 2009 and not just the assembly spaces. As such, the property should return to a productive use, not continue for college administrators to gobble up the most central location in downtown. Washington and Lee should be encouraged to return their college administrators to their expansive, well-funded, and tax-free campus. If you do choose to renew 05 or approve 02, you should not, and I think he may have swapped those. You should not allow a CUP to be granted in perpetuity. Arnie is, of course, correct that violations of the use may render the CUP void, but the fact of the matter is the city is notoriously feckless when it comes to enforcing such things. By having a period of renewal, it allows the Planning Commission and Council to revisit the conditional use and grants the public a formal public setting at regular intervals in which to engage the issue. I realize all parties involved are very important and have a great deal of resources. I also know the importance of WNL isn't lost on many of you and our city council, given the many overlapping connections and personal interests, direct and otherwise. Indeed, oh dear, I seem to have lost some of the words. Does anybody else have a copy? Thank you. Sorry, let's see. Indeed, without WNL, our city would not be the wonderful place to live that it is. However, that does not justify the steady and continuous creep they regularly and at times successfully attempt, no matter how large their endowment. Unfortunately, they're not the only ones gobbling up our town bit by bit. In this one case, however, there is an opportunity to encourage some restraint. I hope you will vote no on CUP 2024-02 and 2024-05. Please deny these requests in defense of those who actually live, work, and vote in Lexington. Many thanks for your service, Patrick Ramey. Okay, having read that into the record, I'm just going to see, is there anybody else who would like to make a comment before I close public comment section? Okay, public. Oh. Please state your name and address for the record.
H.E. Ravenhorst. I live at 322 First Mill Road in Lexington. But more specifically, I work at 19 South Main Street, so I'm quite familiar with Mr. Adams's projects. It's my soundtrack every day. That being said, I'm delighted to have him do that because it's the sound of progress being made. The building next to mine, and I realize that we're supposed to be talking about the courthouse, but since you transgressed with that, I want to respond to that while I can. That building sat essentially empty for, I don't know, 10 years upstairs. There were a couple of offices up there, very underused. When Grands moved out, I don't know what would have gone into that building, but I applaud Mr. Adamson's interest in the city. He does very good work. It's high quality work that he gets done on these things. He's not taking things off the tax roll, is my understanding, whereas if W&L themselves bought things, that might be the case. So he's still paying into the city coffers. And I see it as a win-win situation. So I think those are my comments for now.
Okay, thank you very much. Anyone else? Okay, I'm gonna officially close public comment on CUP 2024-02 and open the commission discussion and decision-making portion. So who would like to go first? Anybody? All right. John, is that you? So I do want to I do want to read the land use chapter strategy number 2.3 for the Lexington Comprehensive Plan that Arnie provided to all of us, but just so everybody knows what we've got up here. The land use strategy 2.3 strongly encourage W&L to program new construction within the present university boundaries to preclude any further loss of local business and industry, as well as the loss of limited taxable land. Okay, so there is that. So comments?
I'm not sure why. I think it's pretty clear cut. The building was intended for the use that it's in. I mean, if we don't approve the permit, we lose that space as a community meeting room. And I think and it doesn't change how it's being used other than that. And so not sure why we would lose an asset like that. I don't know what we have to gain by not approving the CUP with the 2 staff recommended conditions.
Mm-hmm.
My one, perhaps addition or small variation would be that you do have it up for review in 15 years again. Just because we don't know what's coming down the pike. Maybe there won't be enough commercial office space downtown down the road. I would like to see that review being brought back into the recommendation.
But that was never, I mean, am I mistaken? As I read it, that was never part of the renewing the building itself for that use wasn't part of the original agreement. That wasn't the part I mean, looking at this, it doesn't look to me like that's the part that was supposed to be reviewed in 15 years. It was the use of the community space room. I mean, and the reason it was written like that is that was the county's negotiation. What the county wanted was to make sure that they had access and Lexington had access to the meeting room for their meeting space. They thought they might use it.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was the whole impetus for that. And then it did also state and for public use with permission, and you have to have $1 million in insurance, which is common if you're using somebody else's space. But their main reason for including this condition at all was so that the county and the city could continue using that space. As it turned out, I'm not aware of any meetings that we've had specifically for the city of Lexington or the county, but I have participated in Main Street and other organizations that have met there. So I don't see that it makes any sense to add a time limit on the CUP because that wasn't even there initially for the use as office space.
So the use of, I wonder if we might benefit from sort of separating these out. Mm-hmm. Because we've got 2 very different sections, right? We've got the public, the meeting spaces that are either for public use or educational use. And then we've got the rest of the building that is currently in a legal non-conforming use. And they can continue to use this forever, correct? As a legal non-conforming use, as long as they don't stop using it
As long as they don't violate the provisions of the conditions, or if they discontinue it for more than 2 years consecutively, then they would go away, expire.
So I do wonder if there's really any need for a CUP for that, because it's already a right that they have to use.
There's not a need for it because, as you point out, it is a legal nonconformity and it can continue as it is today. The applicant is simply asking that it be included as a condition or as a conditional use permit, simply so that it is on the books as a use that is approved through a conditional use permit, and therefore is no longer limited to some of the rules and regulations that we have that limit nonconformities, legal nonconformities.
So in other words, they could expand it. Is that,
But yeah, but there's almost no place in
Right.
that building to expand, but
I'm just saying that there's
But-
there's not a huge benefit to having the CUP except that it extends beyond the ownership, and then you can not have it for not use it for 2 years and then
if
use
it
it still.
expands, let's say there's an addition to the building, if they got the CUP for the use on the property and then they expanded the building, I don't know how that's going to even be possible historically speaking, or where you do that on the property without creating issues and staying on that particular parcel and not then encroaching on city parcel. But that would likely also require, because you're expanding beyond what is in the footprint of the building today. So there's going to be more of that. So that could also require a revision to a conditional use permit.
Okay. So I guess I'm still not really seeing a benefit to having a CUP, given that it's a legal non-conforming use right now. And I don't
But-
know.
But you can only have one CUP per bill. I mean, you don't do a CUP, a separate CUP for each use, do you?
I can't think of one. I can't think of an example that I've come across here where you may have multiple CUPs.
Yeah.
So it would certainly be a lot easier if you're trying to track 5 years, somebody comes by and says, what is the allowed use? It's much cleaner to have one CUP if that's how the recommendation is made, for both of those conditions to be included, as opposed to having potentially two different ones, or having one that's in perpetuity and one that has a time limit on it. So preference would be to combine them, certainly.
Yeah, I mean, I will admit, when this first came through the last time when we were looking at it, I suggested adding that as a condition, that it could be used as office space, because I think if we're gonna, I assumed, and I still think, if you're writing a new CUP, you need to include everything about it, all the conditions in it. I'm not, unless I was mistaken, and you can write a CUP and leave out certain things. That makes no sense to me.
I think it is cleaner if you're willing to go forward with that, but the property owner still has the right to continue with the office use as it exists today, again, because it
Regardless.
is a legal nonconformity.
Right. And what about for since in 2009, using it for offices, even if it, all right, sorry, I'm backing myself up here. Okay, so the courtroom and the vault room cannot be used for educational uses without a CUP. Is that correct?
Here's where I'm going to trip over myself a little bit because of the way the condition was written originally. There's so much flexibility, the courtroom or the vault room, for either public assembly or private school use. So you have to think that one of those uses would be allowed in one of those rooms, and maybe the other use is not allowed in the other room because of but then that doesn't really make it as clear as to what can happen in the other room if you have the public assembly clearly in the vault room,
Right.
which is what seems to be occurring much more often than any sort of public school use in either the vault room or the courtroom. So if the question is what happens when the administrative office use encroaches into the courtroom, which I haven't been in the building honestly, but I think it's already there. So I'm not sure that's answering your question or not, but there's a difficulty answering it just because there's so much flexibility allowed in that first condition. I think I'll just leave it at that.
And so just going back to the 2009 conditional use permit, it's the courtroom or the vault room can be utilized for private school or assembly purposes, but private school in that definition could mean anything. It could be offices, or it could be a classroom, or
Problem is, we did not have a definition of private school.
from back then. We didn't have one back then.
That's why we have this, at least again, an assumption or interpretation just from the condition that we have is that the office use, and I'm sorry if I'm just repeating something I've already said, but the office use, it was just considered a regular old office use by right, and therefore it wasn't added into the condition that specifically allowed or required a conditional use and allowed the public assembly and a private school to be in either one of those two rooms.
Again, I think your point about separating out the three spaces, because we have
Are we talking that just for discussion purposes or separating out
No,
in
discussion-
motions or?
Discussion.
for discussion. Yeah. Because, and I'm glad to hear tonight that the room, the vault room is used.
Yeah, that's great.
Thank you for mentioning that, because I've heard contrary points that it's hard to access. So it's good to hear that it is. Maybe it would have been helpful for us to, in considering this, to know how often it is used. That would have been a good point of information. Again, my own personal feeling at this point is that in a way, our codes get so complicated. And as Mr. Ramey said, one of the issues we were trying to get away from conditional use permits. So on one hand, I say, why do we need a conditional use permit for W&L as the leaseholder to allow the public to use the space? That's one question. If it's like, oh, I'm sorry, if you don't give us this, you lose rights to that space. That's in a way what I'm hearing.
So are you asking can the public use the space without a CUP? Is that what you're asking?
It's a conditional use in our code. I mean, a public.
Wait,
space.
Leslie, sorry, because one by one, sorry. Ask that again, please.
Are you asking if we need a CUP in order to use the vault room or the courtroom as a public's
Okay,
assembly space?
sorry, Leslie, that's a good question, so I wanted to.
That's fine. And looking at our use matrix, public assembly is a conditional use in C1. So yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
That's
No,
the whole
good.
reason we're doing this. I mean, the other part, nothing is changing with the use of the building. We're being offered an opportunity to extend this past the 15 years that was required. And the public gets to use the space. Right.
So it's public assembly is the request. And it doesn't matter on who's doing the assembly. If it's W&L or if it's John Adamson having meetings there, or if it's the public, it's just the assembly part of it. And if there is going to be assembly and the applicant is asking that assembly continue to occur there, then that is what's driving the CUP request.
I would contend that that's not the primary use of the building, but sorry, I'll take it back. We're only speaking of that space, right?
Right. We're only talking about the
Yeah, that's
courtroom and the vault room.
But this is different than perhaps, I don't know if this is helpful, but when you have primary use and accessory use in the residential, you have the house, the residence is the primary use. Then there's the shed and other things that are accessory uses that are allowed by right. They're just accessory to the main house. But this is different in that it doesn't matter how many uses and whether one is utilized more than the other. And sorry if this isn't helpful, but if it's a use that requires a conditional use permit, if it's used every day, or if it's used once a month or once a year, we still require that to be approved through a conditional use permit, public hearing process.
Right.
I do have
Okay.
one question. So the room that's used right now for a meeting room, is that the courtroom or the vault room? And is it the only room in the building that's used for the meeting space?
That is correct. It was originally the deed room.
Yeah, right.
And at the time we were doing this, the plans were really open and we knew we had to have the open courtroom to be in compliance with the Department of Historic Resources for tax credits,
Oh,
which partially enabled the rehabilitation of the building. That's the right word. So yes, the deed room is the room that seems to lend itself well and is presently being used. And the reason we included both is we thought that it was just literally using the exact same language that was in the original request, and we were just bringing that forward.
okay.
That was the only intention of doing that.
That was my question is, do we need to even say the courtroom? I don't think it matters one way or another, but it's only one room that gets used for public assembly.
Correct.
Okay, thank you. For educational use.
Right. So I guess I'm having a hard, I think I personally like I'm delighted that there is this public use for in that building. And I would love for that to continue. So, and if that's the, if that's the desire of the rest of the planning commission, then that would be great. I am concerned about a conditional use permit granted in perpetuity for the educational facility, college, university use for the rest of the building. So I guess I would personally be in favor of a time limit, just like Mary Stewart was saying. Whether it's 15 years or some other period of time, I just think it's always better for the city to have some sort of say, because while I know that a conditional use permit is conditional on that use and not sort of stepping outside of the bounds, I think the way that this particular one is written, there's very little way that it would not, that you would violate that conditional use, because it's written as a may be utilized. So whether it is or isn't, I think you would have a really hard time saying that they violated this permit, and therefore you take it away if there was some reason to do that in the future. And that would be my concern, is just doing it in perpetuity. I would prefer to have some sort of a leash on that.
In part, we got away from that because you lose track of them. I mean, we didn't even know that this deed restriction was up until staff came by it accidentally. Yeah, because they were preparing for the city hall move and they were copying files.
Sure.
And it wasn't done initially with a deadline date. So if I'm Mr. Adamson and you're telling me you're going to put a limit on it, I'm going to retract the application altogether and we lose the public space.
Why would you do that if you were Mr. Adamson? I mean,
why would I want that kind of stringent requirement when W&L and Mr. Adamson and his investors have put in that much money into a building? The tenant expects to be there for a long term. When all this was negotiated, it was expected that the tenant would be there for a long term. Mm-hmm. And now you have that variability of the city could pull it out from under them every 15 years or whatever cycle. If I were the owner, I would not go for that. And I'd say, fine, you can't use the public space.
Well, that sounds like retribution.
It's good negotiation. I don't understand.
I mean, but the the current use as an educational facility is a legal non-conforming use, so they can do that. And so why, and this is why I wonder why they have to be together. I mean, the second part of this, the condition, I'm looking at page 9 now. That the remainder of the building be utilized for administrative facilities seems unnecessary. And the use of the courtroom or the vault room as an educational facility and or for public assembly purposes does seem like something that we could grant in perpetuity.
But personally, for me, I mean, I think that if we are renewing or the CUP or writing a new CUP, now we have new rules. And one of them is this definition of educational facility, college, university. We have to say at this point, this is how I interpreted it, we have to say at this point that yes, we allow this by saying the rest of the building still can continue that use as offices only. If we're going to approve a permit, I don't see, and we don't include that, sounds to me like they're no longer allowed to do that.
Except that they have, it's a legal non-conforming use, correct? So they do have the right to do that.
Even if you're writing a new CUP, we're writing that, it gets back to that question. Can you have 2 CUPs for a building?
do we need, so you don't need a CUP for what they're doing right now, right? It is a legal non-conforming use.
Correct. But I think it is incredibly helpful if we're going to renew condition number 1 for those 2 uses, and we're going to have all of our regulations in one place. So I think it is helpful just for us in our department and also for continuity and looking back once we get into the future about what was approved, that we don't have to chase down 2 CUPs. We don't have to figure out one is on a limitation of a number of years and the other one isn't. So I think it's just incredibly helpful if you're willing to make a recommendation for both of them to stay together. I don't see the benefit of splitting them up. And if I could add one further item to that, and this is for any condition, regardless of whether it's a time period or not, you certainly have the right to put a time period on a conditional use permit, even though we have in the past, because I want to use the example again of large capacity houses, there wasn't really a benefit to reviewing them frequently because they were never denied, even through the review period. But to get back to another point, impacts from conditional uses are addressed through conditions. Conditions must be reasonably related to the impacts to be addressed. So I would ask that you think about the impact of the use, the impact of the office uses that are there already, and why would the condition, any condition, doesn't matter what it is, time period or not, what's the impact that you're trying to address? And the second part of that we always recommend is that the extent of the condition be roughly proportional to the impact.
I'm sorry, too.
Roughly proportional to the impact. So there's an impact from a conditional use, presumably, and that's why you're addressing it with a condition. So what is the impact from the office use continuing that would necessarily require it to be limited to some period of time, or even to some other condition that you may be considering? So just overall advice, just that the impact to be addressed has to be roughly proportional to what you presume I didn't say that the right way, but you have to be roughly proportional to the impacts to be addressed.
Another, since we have a very dynamic conversation going here. The second clause, and I'm looking on page 9, the remainder of the building may be utilized for administrative facilities related to the educational facility, college, university use. One of the concerns I have is when you read the educational facility, college, university definition that you've put in here, Arnie, it includes more than administrative facilities. So how can we be sure that this would only be related to administrative facilities?
Because it says that in the condition.
The question is, what's the definition of administrative facilities?
we don't have a further definition of administrative facilities, so there is
I
a
mean,
bit
there's
of
a logic to what
interpretation.
they are, but
But
um,
going along that sort of line of thought, perhaps they could not put a dormitory in or special housing or a parking area or a dining hall. Because he's only specifically asking for the
Mm.
administrative facility part of the educational facility definition.
Or classrooms. That would probably be one of my biggest concerns is you don't want classrooms in there. By having administrative facilities, it prevents that.
So I still feel pretty strongly that, I mean, I appreciate your position, but I feel like since the building currently has a legal non-conforming use as administrative offices for an educational facility, I just don't see the need to issue a CUP for that entire building that will go on and on forever. You know, the benefit, I guess, of leaving it as is that if there is a 2-year break, then it can be revisited by a future planning commission. And, you know, as planning commissioners, we are looking out for the future of our community, not just current uses. And I think that, you know, we have a responsibility to make sure that what we're doing is in the best interest of everybody long term. And so I feel pretty strongly about this, clearly.
But the one point you made, I mean, it doesn't matter whether we don't do it or include it in this new CUP. If it's not used for that for 2 years, you'll lose it regardless, right? I mean, so it doesn't, I am fine if you take it out as long as they can keep using it. It just seems to me it doesn't make any sense if we've changed the rules and the definitions. I think we need to make it clear that yes, they are permitted to do that. I don't see how you can get away with not doing that.
Why would we have to do it in perpetuity?
You don't have to do it in perpetuity, but right now it is in perpetuity.
Mhm.
So again, it goes back to, you might lose the public space, but
So then that gets to the question of whether we could do one in perpetuity and one not in perpetuity. The public or the gathering space, the assembly space in perpetuity, and the administrative facilities with a 15-year leash. Is that possible?
You have that discretion, yes.
And would that be 2 different CUPs, or is that one CUP?
I think it's still one CUP, it just has 2 conditions. One's going to have something attached to the end of it that has a time period and the other one may not.
A nice compromise.
well, I guess it's up to Mr. Adamson. I don't see it as a compromise. We're good. You run the chance of losing the public space. I mean, yeah, anyway, that's fine. I've said that enough.
Well, are we to a place where
can you summarize?
so I would say that it sounds like we're all in agreement, I think, that keeping the courtroom and vault room open, or that they may be utilized for educational facility, college, university use, or as a public assembly space, in perpetuity. And the determination of the space would be used, the determination of which space will be used for this purpose is to be determined by the applicant. Space.
Okay.
I think that might not read quite right.
No, and actually, I
As I read it
the
out
qu-
loud.
no, You did, no, but the most important part is the first sentence
Yeah.
that you read. That second sentence, Arnie, who are the applicants? Is it
Well, sorry,
Mr. Adamson or WNL as the leaseholder?
we just brought forward and didn't catch it. At that time, Rockbridge County and Adamson Development or whatever the actual entity is
Yeah.
called were co-applicants. They were both applicants. Now we only have Mr. Adamson representing his company, and you could take off the S in applicants.
Okay, no, I mean, that's just to clarify. And so it's Mr. Adamson and not WNL that determines the use of that space. That's what I'm just,
WNL is not the applicant.
I'm speaking in everyday purposes. When I call up, and say, can I use the space? Yes,
Um, I think that is the intention, yes, and I would do anything I could do to accommodate.
So I will say that the way this is written, it's not determining who can use the space. It's determining which space will be used, whether the courtroom or the vault room. That would be determined by you.
Correct.
The applicant, not who gets to use the space and when.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so that one, I think we are it sounds like we are unanimous about that being okay for in perpetuity. And then the second item in the CUP, the remainder of the building may be utilized for administrative facilities related to the educational facility, college, university use. We have some folks who want it to be on, say, a 15-year cycle, and some who would prefer it to be in perpetuity as well. So
going back to earlier comments, our code is complicated. The simpler we can make it, we'd all be better off. That being said, if we decide to go ahead and expand the rest of the building to be to allow administrative facilities related to the definition of educational facility in college, that is, to me, an expansion of the university. Even though de facto the university is there, the courthouse renovation, the investment, the process, the other investments leveraged that Mr. Adamson described as fantastic. I agree with you. I was speaking to somebody today, and if you hadn't done that, that building might be, it would be in disrepair, and we'd try to put something in it and it wouldn't work very well. So it's not, so in a way, that's not the issue. It's de facto its use has been offices, primarily offices for the university. And again, going back to, if we simplified things and just said, go do what you want by right. And by right, you could have offices in there. Now, Arnie has clarified my earlier thinking. That is not possible. I was thinking, well, if you build a building and put offices in there and you lease it to WNL as offices, that would be by right. But you've clarified tonight that that's not the case if we're going by this definition. Okay. So it's still, to me, a major expansion of the footprint of the university in principle, not just for the courthouse, but we're also discussing it across the street. And so I feel strongly that there should be some kind of review process or a time limit on it. And that's my logic for that. Sorry for the long story, but
that's fine.
complicated.
Well, do we have enough clarity to vote on this?
If the second staff recommended condition were revised just slightly to read, the remainder of the building may be utilized for administrative facilities related to the educational college university use with review after 15 years. Does that satisfy that? Does that,
Arnie, is
You don't
that,
have
is
any,
that the
you don't
kind
have
of,
any teeth unless it's a CUP. So if you're really going to
Part
put a
of it.
limit,
It's
it should
part
be
of it.
part of the CUP,
Yeah.
not just review.
right, so it would be, it would need to,
You keep
so the
op-
conditional use permit would be issued for that part for, 15 years.
Yeah, just keep the opening. Oh, yeah, different here.
On page 9.
Keep
Oh.
that original sentence in there.
okay. Okay.
It would take care, would in essence cover your point.
But it would need to have, if the first part is in perpetuity, then that would need to be stated
Clearly,
clearly.
please.
So you would need to have language in the first one that says this part of the conditional use permit is issued in perpetuity. That only the courtroom, et cetera. And then this part 2 of this conditional use permit is issued for a period of 15 years. I think you'd have to have that very specific language.
Somebody else can read it because I'm not, I don't have it. Make a motion.
Anybody?
So we're working towards a motion?
Mhm.
Okay. I'm going to do it from page 9.
Okay.
1 and 2.
These guys? Oh, here you go.
I move to approve. That's it. I needed you. Open. I move to approve conditional use permit number CUP 2024-02 with the following conditions. That only the courtroom or the vault room may be utilized for educational facility, college, university use, or for public assembly purposes. The determination of which space will be used for this purpose is to be determined by the applicant.
And do you want to say something about
Where do we add in perpetuity?
that might,
Hmm?
that might have needed to go at the very first.
It should.
Could insert that after public assembly purposes
Mhm.
in perpetuity.
In perpetuity, okay? Thank you, Arnie. Everyone happy with that first sentence? Okay. The second condition, that this conditional use permit will
I think you have to.
the remainder of the building may be utilized for administrative facilities related to the educational facility, college / university use
Or
for a period of 15 years.
that,
Arnie?
Arnie, did that get it?
I believe so.
The second.
I second.
All in favor? Aye.
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 Opposed? And the motion carries. Thank you. Okay. Part 1. Part 2. CUP 2024-05, an application by John Adamson to renew a conditional use permit allowing, oops, sorry. I'm on the old one. Backing up, CUP 2024-05, an application for John Adamson for approval of a conditional use permit allowing portions of the Rockbridge building located at 9 through 17 South Main Street, tax map 23-1-72A, to be used as an educational facility, college, university, and as a public assembly. Can we have a staff report?
There are 3 levels to this particular building. You see the photograph there on the bottom of page 104 or the bottom of page 18 of your overall packet. And there are 2 storefronts there. They have somewhere between 1,500 or 1,800 square feet of retail space that will remain. The upper floor and the building is being significantly renovated. The request specifically is for the upper floor. That doesn't really go too terribly deep, but in the remainder of the main floor with the retail spaces in front, but the spaces behind that those 2 areas and the basement be utilized for, again, this administrative office use for the universities that requires a conditional use permit. In addition to that, the secondary request is that the lowest floor also be utilized for public assembly. It's basically, I think, programmed as an open area, and a good example is of a potential user for that is when MockCon comes in and the students have to assemble down there and do all their preparation for MockCon. So it's the basement or lowest floor that's being asked to be both the administrative facility use and the assembly, and then the back portion of the main level and all of the upper level for that administrative facility or office use for a university. Just a little bit of detail on the building over on page 19. You see that we've outlined both the Rockbridge building and the Grand building, and the purpose for that is just to quickly explain these 2 buildings now under one ownership are really being put together and will be functioning as one building in the future. Your request this evening is only for the Rockbridge building because that's what's being programmed thus far. But there is a method or a mechanism of tying the 2 together, and that's by this spine that runs down along the shared wall between the 2. It's more on the Grand building side, and that is a spine that will do all of your functions, public functions, such as getting people through the building at the various levels that they have there, not office space, restroom space, janitorial space. There is a stair tower at the back of the building and an elevator is being installed. So this spine is really will act as for support services for both buildings. And that has already gone through the architectural review board for at least the initial review for 4 different facades on the building, and has gained at least partial approval to at least allow the rear portion of the building to come up out of the ground. And there is an addition of 2-story addition being proposed and permitted and approved by ARB, at least conceptually, for the rear portion of the Rockbridge building. So that's just sort of an overall review of what is being constructed and how the 2 buildings are being tied together. And I think that's all I really have. We've already spoken plenty about the definition for the educational facility, college, university, as well as about the conditions for issuance. There are 3 recommended conditions. The first one is that the entire upper and lower levels of that portion of the main level at the rear of the building and located behind the storefronts facing Main Street may be utilized for administrative facilities related to the educational facility, college, university use. Number 2, that only the lower level of the building may be utilized for public assembly purposes. And number 3, that the storefronts facing Main are not subject to this conditional use permit. Happy to answer any questions.
Is the spine you were talking about, there's no offices above that? And so all the offices are actually in the Rockbridge building. There's none in the Grand building?
That is my understanding, and I would just ask that John, when he gets up, confirms or denies that.
Okay.
Any other questions for Arnie? You look like you're.
Well, I think why are we just considering the CUP for the Rockbridge building when there's a connection to the Grand building?
The uses that are actually going to occur, which is the administrative use and the public assembly use, are only going to occur in the Rockbridge building. Now, you could say that, well, people are going to traverse through the spine that's going to be in, but that's not where the administrative offices will be, and that's not where the public assembly is going to be. That's just, well, I'll just leave it at that.
And is the spine actually connecting these two buildings? Like it says an interconnecting spine. Does that make these buildings one building?
And for all intents and purposes, for building permits, for uses, yes. For life safety, all those things, yes.
So sorry, you said for uses. So how can
Or I
we,
meant use group, never mind. There's a little bit of difference between uses and zoning and use groups, so I shouldn't get into that too much, but they are being brought together, but not, and I'm not sure if this is the question, but it's not any different than the building across the street that we just talked about, where you can only proposing and allowing a use in a portion of or a room of. So at this time, only the Rockbridge building is being programmed. Yes, there's a spine that connects the two buildings, but we don't know what the use or users are going to be, whether or not they need conditional use permits or not. There'd be by right. So there's not a request at this time for the grand building. It's only a request for the space that is the Rockbridge building.
They have separate tax mechanisms too.
I'm sorry, there's separate tax maps, yeah. Okay, any other questions for Arnie at this point? John?
No, I'm just looking at the conditional use permit. Just to,
Okay. Well, then we will, would you like to make an applicant statement, Mr. Adamson?
I'm watching chickens go by, so if I'm smirking, it scared me. Chickens through the woods. Not exactly sure where they were, but I might read this, even though it seems a little less personal, and I hope that's okay.
It's fine.
So as you know, that we are in the process of completing a pretty comprehensive restoration and renovation of the Rockbridge building located at 13 South Main Street, and making another substantial investment in the historic fabric of Lexington's downtown. We will be enhancing and maintaining 2 retail stores, both running on Main Street. They are going to be approximately 1,800 square feet each. And that was very intentional to right size spaces for typical Main Street businesses without having too much space, but also making the rent more affordable, et cetera, et cetera. They will be completely updated with all new life safety systems, including sprinkler, HVAC, electrical, plumbing, and lighting. The areas of the building, which Arnie has articulated, which we are seeking this conditional use permit, are on the ground level, which is accessed just from the rear of the building. It's new addition space behind the Main Street level. It's kind of just a walkout basement back there. And then a little bit of space that was kind of residual space behind the retail, just left over because the retail didn't really benefit from being 3,000 feet plus or minus each. And then the space above it, which was office, and it's proposed to be office again. Our proposed use is just like any other ordinary office use, except now to a recently adopted ordinance, which we've talked about a lot this evening. Anything involving a school requires a conditional use permit to be in compliance with the current zoning. The building will be maintained, occupied, and provide more foot traffic, which will foster a healthier downtown. Our belief is the net impact of the office use and its occupants will be positive for the downtown. Our investment will secure the building's future, which is really an important thing to say. And I've been into the bones of several of these buildings, as we know, whether it be for the Georges or some of these other projects. And buildings by nature just start deteriorating the day that they're done. And so at some point you need to invest a pretty significant amount of money, or you end up losing the building, or they get raised. One of the most important things I feel like we do to each of these buildings beyond the structural improvements are the installation of complete building sprinkler systems. So it not only protects the building that we're working on, but protects the building on either side or the other side of it. If the Southern End fire had gotten out of control and taken out more buildings down the block, they'd be lost forever. And you'd be having new modern buildings sort of mixed in with the storefront. So I really do think that I can't overstate the life safety impact and the protection of those assets more. And so our investment will secure the building's future, not only for the current lease users, but everyone else that follows in the years to come. So these are leases. They're for a very finite period of time. They are allowing a capital investment that may not be possible without them helping sort of with some of the economic development of downtown. And I just share that. If there are any questions, I'm happy to answer. Most importantly, we're updating all life safety systems. We've covered that. These life safety systems are monitored 24/7 by an alarm monitoring company. So if a sprinkler system goes off or a fire goes off, it calls a central dispatch, and Trent and his team come racing down in their engines. And then we believe a safe downtown is good for everybody. And what makes Lexington uniquely Lexington is its old building fabric. Having these buildings protected helps protect them from fire and preserve them for future generations. A couple just historical notes. The Rockbridge building, formerly McCrum's Drugstore, was built plus or minus 1850s. It originally had 3 stories, an iron front that was sort of turn of the century in vogue. And Adair Hutton being next door. Then there was the Fire 49, and it burned pretty significantly what we're now calling the Rockbridge building, McCrum's Drugstore. And that's when in the early 50s, Adair Hutton was rebuilt in that sort of mid-century modern that maybe some of you remember, maybe you don't. And then in the late 70s, early 80s, when Grand Furniture came in, they put this brick facade up the front that kind of encapsulated the cantilevered steel canopy. And the reason the windows feel like they're a little squatty with their arches is because of the canopy that's in place and doesn't allow it to the windows to be scooched up some. At the same time, I'm guessing 20 years after Colonial Williamsburg was going through their Duke of Gloucester sort of refurb, it got the present facade. And what was originally a dance floor up on the 3rd floor is still in place, but they just cut the walls down, put a new roof structure in place, and just lost a story on the building, and then built the slate roof on the front. So, it was an asset that was significantly altered after a fire, and it runs to this day. So one of the reasons that the 2 buildings were, from a code perspective, being intertwined is at Steve's request and Trent's, that from a life safety standpoint, they really need to be thought about together. And instead of trying to put modern life safety, modern stair, modern elevator, all the support spaces required for those things in an 1850s style structure, it just made sense to put it in the building that had more footage to sort of accommodate them. So we're calling it a spine that connects Main Street with McCrum's lot behind it. And that's how we arrived at where we are. So I respectfully hope you all will consider this.
Thank you.
Quick question.
Yep.
Please.
Yes.
Is it conceivable that there will be access from the front there along Main Street to the parking lot for the public? How is that? I'm just curious.
I think it's absolutely conceivable.
Okay.
Now, I think it's absolutely conceivable. This is probably the most direct answer I can give you. There are a couple of the points that I just jotted down here. The office users that potentially will be using this space are already occupying other C1 space in Lexington. So, if there are people in a development office that are office workers, just like in any other building, if it wasn't associated and related to the school or a function in supporting the school, we wouldn't be here asking for this conditional use permit. And when I acquired the building, it was said earlier by somebody that the neighbor, I believe Mr. Ravenhorst, that there were very few uses in the upper level of the building. It was a little tired. It was a rat's maze of doors and hallways and very dim and dark. And frankly, just not very safe. And if you've ever navigated that front stairway off Main Street, you know what I'm talking about, because it's a very long run, not non-code compliant stairs that led into the building. And the other point that I would just make is while the upper floors are being updated, both structurally and systems oriented, they could easily be converted to something residential in the future. But it would be significantly harder to do that now without the improvements of life safety and structure. But the way they're being built at the end of a lease period, it would be easy to make a residential conversion if current ordinances, codes, et cetera, allowed that to happen.
Any other questions?
So will the entrance for the offices, is that in the front on Main Street or is it in the parking lot?
Both.
Okay, so there will be a new door on Main Street wherever the spine is or whatever.
So right now, on the front of the Rockbridge building, there's 2 storefronts. Those are going to be enhanced, refreshed, and left alone. I love the beautiful front of the building. One of the proposed changes that we took to the Architectural Review Board was removing the aluminum storefront doors that were in Shenandoah Attic and restoring them to, more period appropriate wood doors that will make it feel richer and nicer. There's some mutton bars missing. Other than painting, and the second floor windows are in terrible need of scraping and painting. We want to preserve the original single glazed windows and use interior storms on the inside. So we want to be super sensitive to the fabric. There's a door that leads to a narrow stairway that will access the upstairs that DHR is requiring that to remain, and we would like it to remain. There's a new entrance into the spine off of Main Street that's being proposed. That will give us an access point to the different floor connections, levels, et cetera, to allow Main Street access to an elevator that will take you down or take you up and connect all the floors and connections. And then, of course, there's the stair in the back of that same space that would take you down to McCrum's lot and out of the building.
And the spine would be access, you're talking about the spine being accessed from Main Street, yes? And that would be as part of what's currently the Grand or the former Grand, the Adair Hutton building.
Yes.
And to Mary Stewart's point, where would a potential access be for the public through the building to the McCrum's lot?
So right now there's the unimproved alleyway that everyone uses just down the street.
Mm-hmm.
And this will be a doorway on the front of Main Street that takes you into a hallway corridor connection, and you could find a stairwell and find your way out the back door to the lot.
So, but you would have to go into a W&L space basically to get there.
You'd have to go into the building space. Now the W&L is a tenant off
Yeah.
of some of these spaces, but you would be in a common corridor.
Okay. Any other questions?
Yeah, and just a clarification, all the offices that we're discussing today will be in just the Rockbridge building. There won't be any any college educational use by our broad definition in the Grand building.
Correct. The Grand building, the short answer is at this point, we've contemplated all sorts of concepts from tearing the building down to condo renovations above to smaller retail. What the most recent current thought, and it's not up for discussion today, but we have done extensive study, and there's an opportunity to make a connection point off of Washington Street. So the side of the Grand building has this nondescript plywood cladded brick, and there's an opportunity to put in another, let's say 15 to 1800 foot retail space facing Washington Street. And that's something we'd absolutely like to do. We actually presented that to the Architectural Review Board recently. So we really don't know at this point. That's why we're coming forward specifically with the Rockbridge building. And yes, just offices just in the Rockbridge building and the spine that helps support those.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
One question,
Wait.
Mr. Adam. The lease period that you mentioned, how long is that typical lease period to recapture the capital investment for you?
I'd have to double check the
But
document itself.
approximately
15 years.
15 years. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. All right, we will open the floor for public comment. Are there any members of the public who would like to make a statement? Yeah, please.
to restate my name?
Um,
No.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and I'm sorry I commingled two buildings. I
it's okay.
wasn't aware that this was two separate issues, but basically, we're just really pleased that we are having an historic building restored and brought up to current uses. So we're very pleased that we now have the two new retail spaces that will have modern plumbing, modern electricity. And then the building itself is ADA compliant as well as fire suppression. I know I've had many discussions with our fire department and specifically Trent Roberts, and he is always very happy to see a building have fire suppression put in it. So we are pleased about that. The upper stories were always offices and very familiar. I'm very familiar. It was a crazy steep stairway to the office spaces from Main Street. And so the fact that all of this is going to be much more accessible and easier to use, we're just very happy to see. And as I said earlier, the businesses I spoke to, especially the one business that wants to move back into the original space of the Rockbridge building, are thrilled. And I just would like you all to understand that this, from the business community, this isn't majority of the business community. There are always some folks that do feel strongly about W&L coming into the spaces, but generally we're accepting of it and pleased that the building is beautifully restored for historic preservation. Thank you.
Thank you. Sure.
Heck, came in here. Just the idea, I guess, that having that building fully leased as an office building, which now I think previously maybe 1 or 2 units were being used. It's kind of just a black hole on Main Street. You know, as a merchant on, you know, in the historic district, as people come into work, as they go to lunch, as they leave in the evening, those become people that put, you know, pedestrians on Main Street. They're pedestrians that are walking down there. And it's a big plus, the more that we can fill these spaces, especially with people that are gainfully employed that maybe have some disposable income. Because a lot of these spaces were so threadbare that the people who are willing to lease them are probably not our customers. So I kind of like the idea that it's going upscale and it's bringing in new customers that maybe wouldn't be downtown or wouldn't be on Main Street. So I would be in support of it.
Thank you.
H.E. Ravenhorst. My office is at 19 South Main Street. I'm an architect. I've worked in the past for John, but not on this project. He's got some out of town bunch doing it, but I don't know. I guess they'll be okay. But I just want to mention that I've had an office in what you're calling the Rockbridge building, starting in the late 1960s. Been in various rooms there, so I thoroughly know that building. Although at this point, one wouldn't recognize it because Mr. Adamson has it completely gutted. And these sorts of things don't come cheap. And as has been mentioned, when he's done, it'll be a state-of-the-art, safe, fire-resistant structure that's good for the whole block, for the whole city. And in order to pay for that kind of thing, he needs some tenants that can afford to pay a reasonable rent. And that's, I think, when Washington and Lee comes in, they're willing to pay a reasonable rent to him. And I can sort of appreciate the fear of this Washington and Lee beast taking over the city, but again, I grew up here. Washington and Lee has been very kind to me. I did not go to Washington and Lee, but it has a very positive influence on the city, and we shouldn't pretend that it doesn't. And I can understand not wanting to gobble up all the real estate, but I don't think that's what's happening here. I think they're contributing to the community by paying some reasonable rents so that he can afford to house these shops and other entities in there. So I would strongly encourage you to approve what he's requesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further comments? All right, I will close the public comment section and open it up for commission discussion.
I do have one question for Mr. Adamson, probably. So will there be any signage other than the usual address WNL sign that they put on buildings indicating that WNL's in that building?
I can't speak to that with any authority, but what I can say is that any signage would have to go through the architectural review board.
Right.
And so they would have a say in what that is. And I'm sure that there's a very lengthy signage ordinance that talks about size and placement and location and all those things. You know, the businesses that are the retail businesses are certainly going to have some signage.
Right.
I think it would not be unreasonable to assume that if there was a, you know, new storefront door in this front of the hyphen, that there might be some signage on that door or inside that vestibule space. But I can't speak with any more authority than that.
Right. My only concern would be, no problems with the retail spaces. They should have signage, just as the old courthouse building, it doesn't have any signage saying it's WNL other than that one address sign that they use regularly. And I think that's a benefit or an asset to it, that they're kind of hidden if they do end up using that space, rather than not having a big Washington and Lee sign out front.
Yeah, I think that that's fair and would be a reasonable assumption.
Okay. Thank you.
I have a question about the parking. So well, first of all, how many offices would you anticipate being in this, like an office space used by about how many people?
I'll have to think about that, and I can do that quickly and then come back and give
Okay.
you a more precise number, because I don't have that number on the top of my head.
Okay.
As far as the full-time equivalents that are anticipated, I would say that the school has a parking garage across the way. There is a public lot that's a 3-hour lot in McCrum's lot. We do have another interesting bit of Lexington lore. We do have 12 feet all the way down to Jefferson Street, but the city actually leases to other people on private property, which is just a separate conversation for a different day to figure out how to untangle some of that. But whether it's an office building or an institutional use or non-institutional use, it's still an office building. And it was an office building previously, so I'm not totally clear on how the number of parking spaces would directly affect for the conditional use permit that's being requested, and specifically.
Well, sometimes it's just it's a piece of information that can help us in our decision-making process. So I guess one thing that so I know you said they have a parking lot. Are you talking about the one, sorry, which parking lot are you talking about?
Well, they have a parking garage
You're talking about the one that's beyond
on campus off
on-
Washington Street. They have a pit that is off of Lee Ave. You know, at the bottom of the stairs we just contributed recently, kind of behind the Domino's Pizza.
Right.
And of course, they have the courthouse parking garage on the other side. And I would imagine those would be the parking lots traditionally used.
Okay. So part of why I'm curious is because you mentioned the McCrum's lot with the 3-hour parking. If we're talking about a lot more people using the McCrum's lot for parking, that is fewer parking spaces that can be used for people who are coming in and using retail, to the retail stores. It's hard to find, sometimes it's hard to find parking is what I'm getting at.
I think that that's just, that's an issue before this project. It'll be an issue after this project. It's an issue for sure. I think that one of the things that we likely should be talking about is when we invest millions of dollars in a building to renovate and restore it, that building does go on the tax rolls, again, in perpetuity. And we pay a lot of money in tax. I probably should have come prepared with that number as far as what gets sort of contributed. So, it's one of those arguments, having office space and having people walking downtown is healthy for downtown. And yes, those people have to park, but I'm not aware that having the courthouse occupied with office space has created any headaches from a parking perspective downtown that are new, I guess, would be the question that I would ask. But,
Okay. And then I understand that the Rockbridge building, so I'm looking at this map, this drawing. Are you planning to expand the back of the Rockbridge building to the property line, or?
yes, we do have additional property behind the building,
Mhm.
and we are expanding on the rear of the building, 2 levels,
And so from the ground up.
ground up, 2 levels.
Okay. And so that's going to be removing some parking in the McCrum's lot, correct?
Well-
I just clarity.
Well, there were 2 additions. One was a crazy single-story addition on stilts, if anybody recalls that. And there was an old cinder block boiler room. And both of those, with permit, have been raised.
Mhm.
And so there clearly wasn't real parking there unless you parked underneath that structure.
Mhm.
So, and then there were a bunch of gas meters back there as well. So, we are by right adding one to the back of the building.
Mhm.
And as far as the parking lot itself, yeah, maybe there'll be a few spots back there in order to have life safety, be able to get fire engines to and from the back. That would be a requirement of the city, less than a requirement for me. The parking lot back there is a little bit of a mess, if we're being honest. Not only from a property rights standpoint, because Southern Inn owns a whole stretch that goes behind their building, the Harris's, and then we've got a stretch that goes and hits Jefferson Street on the other side, and then the city's kind of got this clump in the middle. So another conversation for another day, but certainly hoping to see some capital improvement in the future back there in the lot for the benefit of everybody.
Sounds like a parking garage.
With a green roof.
There you go. Solar panels. Thank you.
One more.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Just clarification. If you could describe the spine, I'm trying to understand the functional relationship between the 2 buildings.
So from a life safety standpoint,
But when you say a spine, does that mean, a passageway? Are they connected, or I just.
trying to figure out how to explain this effectively, but you've got the Rockbridge building, Main Street level, because the sidewalk and the street goes this way. You've got the Grand Building on 1 South Main at this level, and you've got the spine connector at this level, and you got a rear parking lot at this level, and you've got 4 different levels within the 20,000 feet of the Grand Building or the 1 South Main. So it becomes a significant challenge, complicated by the fact that when it was built as Adair Hutton with the canopy, there was encased concrete that was part of the sidewalk that was captured with a new masonry wall that became Grand Storefront. So that area was hidden and disguised as raised storefronts within the business of the furniture store. And you still see that today when you walk into Shenandoah Attic or Ladles and Lemons. So having to pick a connection point that works for handicap access off of Main Street so we don't get sued by people, that then gets you into a concrete level that then goes up a ramp and then communicates with an elevator, multiple stories, and then our paths of egress out of each of those spaces within X number of feet to get to daylight is the purpose of the spine. And it's pretty complicated, just like your codes and ordinances are, but it um, was a design process with the architects. And for the record, very much like Mr. Ravenhorst, did him right of first refusal, which
Oh, he's gone.
He's already gone.
I did go see him and he said, there's enough hair on this one, I'm running. So that's why I used a Richmond firm to do it. But the point is that Steve and Trent were very involved in the process and asked that we kind of marry the buildings to make them safer. And so that was kind of more on them than it was on me to sort of arrive here. But again, typical fashion, collaborative, trying to work together as I find and feel like I do with Arnie to help make safe buildings.
So if I enter, I'm just trying to understand, if I enter the spine, would I enter through a door from the sidewalk on the ground
On
level
Main Street.
or Main Street? And then I could get in an elevator and go to either building somehow.
Theoretically, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Comments, questions, concerns?
I love that it's ADA. I think that's really great. I think
Yes.
that's one of the things that's so difficult about downtown. And so I think that's great. Like the elevator, right? Like that doesn't seem like a big thing, but it really is. So I love that. That's my only real thought at this exact moment.
I want to say that, and I believe it was in the Rockbridge building. Weren't there residences up there not too long ago?
They were two apartment type spaces that were, I would say, substandard. They would not meet current code because in order to have residential of any sort of commercial, it's required to be sprinkled. And they were not occupied at the time that I acquired the building, to my knowledge.
Did one of them even have a full kitchen? My recollection on a tour going up there was it was used as a short-term rental because it didn't even have a full kitchen, but.
If memory serves, that might have been a longer countertop than the kitchen.
Yeah.
And that had a sink and a stove.
Any other, John?
Well, what I would suggest to us is that, I don't know the exact procedure, but that we table this until the next meeting and continue the discussion. Again, the merits of it are commendable, and the sensitivity of the design approach is much appreciated. I think when I hear from people in public who call me up about this, again, one of the main concerns is WNL expansion, WNL expansion, WNL expansion. And and yet on the other hand, we could say, in certain cases, it's fine. It makes sense because otherwise this particular building would not be improved. There's only WNL can come up with the rents to pay back the expenses. What would be useful, because we're setting precedent. So again, one of the things I learned very easy, sorry if it's too late, so my brain's gonna go. One of the things I learned very early in planning commission is no matter how compelling the applicant is in front of me, I'm not just approving that applicant. I'm improving that building for its entire time. Any conditions travel with that building. You may sell that building in 5 years, for all we know. You won't, but you understand my principle that I'm not just looking at who's going to be using it immediately, but what are the longer term implications? What would help me in looking at this is if there was a little bit more information that helps us understand what you've described so well tonight. But you've done that verbally. There are no drawings here to help us understand it. And so, for example, in the conditional use permit, the entire upper and lower levels and portion of the main level to the rear of the building located at the storefront may be utilized. I would love to have a floor plan that showed that. Not just me, but the public. We're concerned about the bigger issue of expansion. How many square feet are we talking about? I mean, not necessarily square feet, but at least a drawing. Only the lower level of the building may be utilized for public assembly purposes. Again, there's a kind of a gap in information there. What does that mean? What is public assembly in that purpose? What's the intended use? And then that the storefronts facing Main Street are not subject to this conditional use permit. Well, that's, you've clarified that. So that, I think that would help me and also help other people who have approached me in understanding the value of the investment and how it's going to be used.
May I respond?
You may.
Um,
We have a very good interactive format here tonight.
I love it. I love it. And I might have a sleepy brain also.
Excuse me.
So, let me first by just commending, the commission for being involved and active and thoughtful. I think that, it's clear that you love Lexington, and I hope it's clear that I love Lexington. And I think that you can tell where people's priorities are by where they spend their money, right? Just in general, whether it's children, whether it's business, whether it's whatever, it's just is what it is. I feel like there are just a couple points that I would like to make. One, and I want to be very careful that I tread lightly on this next comment, but when I went forward with the concept of acquiring the building, I felt like I did my due diligence. I had multiple conversations with the building department, with planning department, this is sort of what I'm doing. At no point in time was it brought up that there had been a change in the ordinance, and that I was going to have any headwinds specific to what we're here to talk about tonight.
Mhm.
I had advanced with the acquisition of the building. I had spent a pile of money on plans. I had engaged a tenant whom I did not have prior to acquiring a building. And they sort of sought it out, and it was very important to them that we maintain the business storefront from the very beginning, as it was to me as well, on Main Street. They were very in tune with that. And so we were trying to take space that was previously wet, damp storage space. There was a mortuary table, for gosh sake, in the basement with an arm's reach of a grill hood. Go figure. I don't know what the story there is. But and then the space sort of behind and above, thinking that this is the perfect blend of all cases because Main Street keeps business and it's a brand new storefront that's not cut up with all sorts of walls. So a store operator will be able to see their inventory and see their front door and be able to control their business with a single person running the business as opposed to needing multiple people because they can't see all the corners of their store.
Are you referring to the grand building at this time, John?
I'm referring to the Rockbridge building.
Okay.
Because the Shenandoah attic, you couldn't see all the little nooks and crannies, and you couldn't do that in Littles and Linens either because there was a wall and it was really crazy. So also some stairs and transitions in both of those spaces, I might add. When Arnie brought it to my attention as it related to the courthouse and the conditional use permit, and by the way, I think we might have a challenge over here. It was a little bit retroactive, and I absolutely embraced. I didn't fight. I didn't argue. I wanted to come forward, just like instead of trying to say we have a legal non-conforming use. If you've adopted a new policy, I want to meet you where your new policy is. Now, we negotiated in good faith in 2008, and very open public process. We invested a lot of money at the time based on that negotiation. So, in good faith, we want to meet decision-making boards, kind of where they are, if I'm speaking clearly. But here we are moving forward and you are having a slightly different interpretation of things. And I want to honor that and also respect where we were and where we've been. But I certainly understand the ordinance now. And I think that your staff certainly understands the ordinance now. But at the time this came forward to me, I just want everybody to kind of understand that it wasn't clear, and wasn't made clear. So I would hope, I don't totally understand. An office user is an office user is an office user. They dress the same, they work the same, they receive their check from one employer versus another. And so obviously there's a concern about creep. And I want to be a good citizen. I want to be a good steward. I want to be a good landlord. I want to be a good community member. I brought my daughter to a concert here just the other night. I brought another daughter here to have dinner just the other night. So I love Lexington. And I want you to really hear that. Like, I'm not just here and running and living in a different place. My children are in school in Richmond, or we might be a little closer. But to that end, I wish timely answers are really important to people in my world, because time is money. And, making decisions in a timely manner is really helpful. So if the board, the commission, needs to table this, that's absolutely the commission's prerogative. I would ask that you really think about that, because the plans you're requesting have been in the building department for months, and they're available. They were available at the time this application was filed. I wasn't aware that I needed to bring them to this meeting, but they're absolutely there with your staff and in the building. Then those plans would answer every question that's been asked tonight with regard to the details you're asking.
Thank you. So, and in response to that, I would say, we haven't seen them. We have not seen those plans, and tonight is the first time that we've had the opportunity to, in a public meeting, consider this request. So I think that, given that we've been at it for 2 hours and 15 minutes, I think and it's been a long discussion. I think that, you made a comment about an office is an office is an office, but in Lexington, I think it's fair to say that, as John said, people are concerned about W&L creep. And not that we are going to say, no, it can't be W&L. That the commission hasn't voted on that. But I think it's fair to say that we would like a little bit more time to actually look at those plans. And so I would ask Arnie if you already have those plans, if you can maybe forward those to us sooner than later.
We have them in a great big old roll, like when I say a roll, a fat roll that big.
So
it'd be easier if you wanted to stop by, or we could take photographs of 1 or 2 sheets that are the layout of all 3 different levels. Maybe that's the best way of doing it, and then send it to you that way.
I'm not sure what that has to do with the use. I mean, I do appreciate your question. John, can you explain what the public assembly piece of it is? Do you know how that will be used? Is it just meeting room in general, or?
Again, maybe the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So the downstairs of this building, we've done substantial underpinning, and now could have ceilings as high as 12 feet tall. That being said, it has been shared that this may be rotating space for different groups, sort of swing space, we might say. And one of those groups may be MockCon. And if MockCon had some sort of student assembly, I just was trying to check all the boxes. It is not absolutely determined to be meeting space. I just didn't want to be caught in a position where there was any appearance of impropriety with regard to use. But I'm not aware of any any immediate use or desire to have it be that, other than just was looking for flexibility for swing space type users.
Right.
Okay.
Thank you. That's very
Thank you.
helpful. And I will not be here next meeting, so I do want to say a couple of things that this project meets one of our comprehensive plan and well, meets several goals in our comprehensive plan and our strategic plan, that it is expanding the tax base significantly. This is a significant improvement, and that's been one of our goals, is to continue increasing the tax base. It may be W&L in that space, but John owns it, and so have full taxes paid on it. And the benefits I've seen in, say, the IT building is it gets people off campus. I know, having been on the Main Street board, that was one of our goals, was to get the students and the faculty and the parents off campus and into town. And I eat downtown at least 4 days a week. And I see the folks from those buildings going and eating out rather than eating on campus and shopping downtown. So it does make a difference to be located in town versus campus. It's only 2 blocks, but it makes a difference. And I would have some concerns if we didn't have enough office space in Lexington. But we know from the city hall search for Lexington, looking for some swing space, there are other large office spaces available. So it's not that we aren't close to zero vacancy, whereas this would cause a problem, because that would cause me concern. I'm also concerned that in 2 years, Department of Social Services is going to move it out of downtown. So we will have a lot of office space available downtown. So I don't see that this, as far as the use, will displace anybody. So for those reasons, I think it has a lot of positives. As long as W&L doesn't have a big presence, I wouldn't want to see them having a storefront in this building or even at the Grand building. But the fact that they're hidden, have their office space, I think we can handle that till we reach a saturation point. And that would be what Planning Commission needs to discuss and determine what's that saturation point. And I personally don't feel like we're there, because we do have available office space.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. All right, anybody else need to weigh in before we? Okay, so I actually have one more question for you, which is, do you have the digital images for the plans that you could pass on to Arnie so that we could get them more quickly? That would be really helpful. And then Arnie, if you could pass those on to us just as soon as you can, that would be so that we can have some time to really review it and great. Thank you. All right. So we'll table this discussion until our next meeting in 2 weeks.
We have a motion and
3 weeks.
Well, then I'm waiting for a motion.
And it'll be 3 weeks. We have
Okay.
there's
So
a
yes,
fifth
yeah.
Thursday.
I move that we table this discussion on CUP 2024-05 to our next meeting in September.
Do we have a second?
Second.
All right. All in favor
I
and opposed?
Nay.
All right. Motion carries with 4 in favor and 1 opposed. Okay, so we will see you at our next meeting and we'll continue this discussion. Thank you for your patience. And I will say that I think that it's important to, because of the history of Lexington having these institutions, I think it's just important to make sure that we get full engagement on these issues for the future. So it's not about you and it's not about W&L. It's just, I think we want to make sure that we're doing the right thing for the community. So thank you. Okay, so do we need a motion to table the zoning? Can we just skip that one for
skip
for
that one,
today?
that's fine.
Okay.
John really wanted to spend an hour and he's fresh.
John's like, I'm ready to go.
All right.
John.
At least he stayed around.
All right. So, do we have a zoning and planning report?
Absolutely not. I mean, no.
Okay, city council report.
Just one quick thing. We did approve the zoning ordinance amendment, with the exception of the one regarding the townhomes being on a private street. There was some comments on that, and so we just pulled it so that we as a planning commission could look at townhomes a little closer altogether. Not that not that council was against it, but we figured we could use more time looking at that. Yeah, that's all I have.
Sounds familiar. Okay, well, here we are. We're at the bottom of the agenda. We'll just stay here.
I move that we adjourn our planning commission.
Do we have a second?
I second.
Good.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? No, and the meeting is adjourned. Thank you all. Thank you to the audience for sticking with us.